and welcome to Wilder Outdoor Academy. Today's lesson is the first of a two-part lesson series where I'll teach you how to ice fish. Today's lesson will be about planning your fishing trip. Planning is essential to making sure that you catch fish and that you have a good time. So in today's lesson, we will go over some basics of safety on the ice, because ice can be very, very dangerous. But that said, with a little bit of knowledge, you'll be totally fine. And then we'll cover what I call the what, where, when, and how of fishing. And what that means essentially is we're going to figure out, what are we targeting? What kinds of fish do we want to catch? Because the kind of fish you want to catch will affect how you fish for them, and the equipment that you use, and the depth that you choose for your location, and all sorts of other things. So what you're fishing for is an essential first step. Then we'll figure out where, finding your location. Okay, look, fishing is a lot like real estate. Location, location, location. If you don't set up in the right spot, there won't be fish and you won't catch them. So I'll give you an in-depth tutorial here on how to pick the right spot. Then we'll go over when. Fish eat just like us at certain times of the day. So it's pretty simple, but an important thing to know. And then finally, how, which is the technique and the equipment, and that sort of thing. So with that, let's get started. Ice safety is so important. People do die on the ice, but it's only because they didn't do their research ahead of time and didn't make good choices. So when ice is thin, you can fall through it. And we obviously do not want that, because then you could, hypothermia could set on. It's very hard to get out if you do. Now, that said, once ice is 4 inches thick or thicker, you are perfectly safe to walk on the ice. How do you know if it's 4 inches thick or thicker? First thing is, see if there are other people out fishing. If there are, it's a good sign. Second, if people have already gone out and you can talk to them, ask them how thick the ice was. You'll know when you drill through it. And third, if you get out and you feel like it's 4 inches thick, drill a hole in a shallow area, see how thick the ice is. So there's some options for you to know that you're safe. Once it's 4 inches thick, you're in good shape. It'll hold you up. You'll see that people even drive their cars out on the ice. Now that said, just for safety's sake, I always carry a pair of spikes. So if I do fall in, I have these around my neck. They sell these at most outdoor stores. And if I fall in, I can grab these and stake it into the ice to help pull myself out. If for any reason you do fall into the ice and you don't have stakes, what you will want to do is first calm down, breathe and relax, control your breathing. From there, what you don't want to do is have your body facing this way. You don't want it facing or pointing vertically. You want to get your body horizontal. From there, you'll grab onto the edge and kick as hard as you can to try to pull yourself out horizontally. You will not be able to push yourself out of the water. So hopefully you're never in that situation, but if you are, that's a little bit of information that could help save your life. Now that said, if the ice is 4 inches thick, which here today it very much is, you'll be just fine. So where do you fish? Choosing your location is really important, especially because this is ice fishing. So if we were doing open water fishing, we had a boat, we could try out lots of different areas and move around and see where the fish are. Well, in ice fishing, you have to dig a hole. Digging a hole is a lot of work, or not digging, you have to drill a hole. And it's a lot of work. And so if you don't get the right spot, or at least the right area at the beginning, you're gonna have to go search and drill other holes. So planning is essential. Try to figure out where you're going to drill your holes from the very beginning, before you even set out. And the way to do that is to look at a depth chart. I'll show you an example of a depth chart and show you how to use it and how I found this spot. But what you want to know is that the key to finding a good spot in the winter is anywhere between 10 and 20 feet is where the fish are going to be hanging out. They don't generally hang out in the shallow water because it's too cold and there's too much variability in the temperature. So they go deeper to where there's more stability in the temperature. Now that said, let's look at a depth chart and see how I found this spot. This is a depth chart. What do we use depth charts for? Depth charts are there to help us figure out where the fish will be, because especially if we are ice fishing, we're going to have to drill a hole, and if we get it in a spot where there aren't fish, we're going to have to go drill some other holes. Also, we can't see through the ice, so it's not like we can look for things like vegetation or weed lines, things like that. So using a depth chart when you're planning your ice fishing trip is really important. So where did I get this depth chart? I go to usa.fishermap.org, although you can really just Google the lake you're hoping to fish at and depth chart, and you will most likely find one for free somewhere on the internet. So how do we use this? If you look at a depth chart, you'll notice lots of lines, lots of concentric lines. And if you've ever read a topographical map, this is basically an upside down version of that. I mean, each line represents a depth in the lake. Now, this is a lake that's nearby my house and that I fish a lot. And if we look at the deepest part, everything inside of this peanut shape is 29 feet deep. Anything outside the peanut but inside of this line is going to be 28, 27, 26, 25, 24, and so on. Now, when we're looking at a lake, there are a few things we want to consider for where we should be fishing, where we should be drilling our holes. So in general, as a rule of thumb, between 10 and 20 feet is where we want to be. Depth is important because fish use depth to regulate their temperature. They're cold-blooded. But it's also where vegetation will grow, which is structure for all kinds of things, namely bait fish. So fish will come up into the weeds to feed within that depth. There are also two features that we want to keep an eye out for. The first will be drop-offs. Now, if we look over here, we will see that the depth increases rapidly, and that looks like a bunch of lines that are really close together. So here, within just what in real life would be probably 20 or 30 yards, we go from 10 feet to over 20 feet. Close lines mean a big drop-off. We like fishing off of drop-offs because the big fish go to the deeper water to regulate their temperature, but then swim up high into the grasses to feed when it's time to eat. The other thing that you might look for is a plateau, or sort of an extended area that falls within the depth range that we're looking for. Up here is a great example. This sits right within our target range for a good bit. You can see this is a big area. Now, this might not be as productive as a drop-off, but it will be an area where you can drill lots of holes. You don't have to have a lot of precision in where you are drilling to potentially have success. And there are most likely to be fish in there because it is in the range where weeds tend to grow. So if you're new to ice fishing, which if you're watching this video, you probably are, the best thing that you can start fishing for is what are called panfish. And panfish are smaller fish, but they're easy to catch, and they're in most every lake that you can imagine, right? And so the two main species are what are called crappie and bluegill. Crappie are sort of the more choice of those two if you're going to eat them, but they're generally a larger black and white fish with black spots on sort of a whiter body. And then panfish, those are both panfish. Sunfish or bluegills are, there are lots of colors and lots of variations of them, but they all have sort of a dot on their gill. But again, all an easy fish to catch. Great introduction for kids who may not have been fishing before, who are still learning to fish, as well as for adults who are excited about fishing. I'm excited to go pan fishing today. So we will be targeting panfish, and that will affect the depth that we fish at and the bait that we use and the tackle that we use. So when should you be fishing? When are the fish biting? Now this changes all the time. This is not a hard and fast rule, but on lakes, typically, fish are more likely to feed right around sunrise and sunset. So when you're planning your trip, if you want to have success, sometimes it's best to be uncomfortable a little bit, get up really early, and head out before the sun rises. The good news is that if you do that, you have a longer day of fishing, and if you wrap up early, you still have the rest of your day to hang out and do whatever else you'd like to do. So before you start fishing, the last thing you want to do is make sure you have all the right gear. Now in ice fishing, the most important thing you need is an auger, an ice auger. Now this auger is connected to a drill, but this is a hand auger that has a handle. So if I didn't use the drill makes things go a little bit faster. But if I didn't use the drill, this handle would go into here. I would push on the top and spin like this. And with enough rotations and enough pressure, the blades on the bottom here would eventually cut through the ice and get us into the water. So you definitely need an auger. Augers can get very, very expensive. I don't think you need that. I bought my auger for $20 used on Facebook Marketplace, and I bought the drill attachment for $20 on Amazon. The drill, obviously, I had in my garage, but again, doesn't need to be a very expensive piece of equipment in your toolbox. Once you get your auger set up, the next thing you'll need is an ice fishing pole. Now you see the ice fishing pole is shorter than a regular fishing pole. That's because you want it to sit over the hole, which is going to be very close to you. If you had a long pole, you'd have to sit very far away from your hole to be able to fish. Now this pole isn't set up, but I'll show you what tackle you should use if we're using panfish and how to set it up and tie your knots in a minute here. The last thing that you'll need, actually it's not the last thing, two more things after this, is you will need an ice scoop. This is about $5 to $10 at the store, or if you want, just bring a pot. But the idea is you want to use this to get any floating ice out of your hole so that you can get your bait down into it. You can see this one has some holes in it to drain the water out. When you drill into the ice, snow is going to fall in, leftover slush from when your drill went down is going to float up. So get a scoop. You'll also need something to sit on. Ice fishing is not a standing game. I have a very small camping chair, but really, honestly, one of the best things you could use is just a 5-gallon bucket. And the bucket can double as something you can bring home your fish in. So, something to sit on. The last thing you'll need, and it's not, you can see the tip of it here in the screen, but it's sort of off camera, is you'll need a sled. You need something to carry your stuff out onto the ice with. Now you can use just a regular kid's sled if you don't have a lot of equipment. As your equipment gets more and more, we'll say, robust, as you get more and more things that you're going to use to ice fish, you'll need a bigger sled. So I use a small sled that's designed specifically for ice fishing. But again, at the beginning, just use a kid's sled, you'll be fine. Now, we're going to get into the details of how to set up our poles. So in fishing, there are two really important things So when you're fishing, there are two essential parts of your setup. The first is a hook, and the second is bait. The hook is what the bait goes on, and the hook is what goes into the fish's mouth and pulls them out of the water for you. Now, if we're ice fishing, especially for panfish, we're going to use a very specific hook and some very specific bait. This hook that I have right here, and I'll hold it up real close so you can see it, is a jig head. It's a very small jig head. A jig head is a piece of metal, so essentially a weight, on a hook. What that's going to do is that's going to get our bait down to the bottom, and they typically have eyes painted on them, so they kind of look like fish or some kind of animal. And we're going to put our live bait on the hook and jig it up and down so that the fish are attracted to it and they come and eat it. For bait, we're going to use what are called wax worms. Not going to lie, wax worms are gross, but fish eat them. They're basically grubs, tiny little grubs. You can get them at any bait store. If we're pan fishing and you don't want grubs or wax worms, you can use regular worms as well. That'll certainly work. But we definitely want either worms or wax worms if we're targeting panfish. Now the last thing that we use for panfish that you don't necessarily need, but that I like to have, is a bobber. And this is an ice fishing bobber. It's a little bit different than the bobbers we use when the water is not frozen. It's basically a small piece of foam with a hook, and then there are some pre-tied knots that we slip onto our line that will set where that bobber can go. And I'll show you that up close here in a minute. But those are the essentials for setting up your ice fishing trip. So let's get started on setting up our line. I've got you up close here so you can see all the details, but the first step that we're going to use for our panfish setup is, or the first thing we're going to do is to put on our bobber. Now, like I said, the bobber is a piece of foam with a hook on it. You can see it there. And a knot that's already been tied, but it's around a small piece of tubing. The reason we do that is we're going to slip this onto our line and move it around. So how do we do that? I've got my fishing pole right here. And I do this before I put my hook on. It's really important that you do this before you put your hook on, because this is going to sit above your hook. And if you tie your hook, you will not be able to slide the knot on. But I will run my fishing line through this little plastic tube, as you can see here. And what I'm going to do is slide the knot upwards off of the tube, slide the tube off the line. I don't want to leave the plastic on the water, so I'll put that in my pocket. Then I'm going to pull the loose ends of this knot together here. Now, ideally, I'd have some scissors too to cut this, but today, because I'm out on the ice, I don't have some scissors. Normally, I would set this up before I go out. It's always nice to have it set up before you go out so you can just start fishing. But typically, you'd want to cut these two pieces here so that it's not so dangly. It's not going to keep you from catching fish, but it's going to be a little bit of a pain in the butt, especially when you reel in. And then what we will do once we start fishing, we don't want to do this before we start fishing, is we'll take this bobber and we will hook it underneath of the knot once we know the depth we want. What that's going to do is the line's going to pull down and it's going to stop at where the knot is. And we want this bobber on here because when the bobber starts to go underwater and we feel a tap, 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 that's when we know a fish is biting. And that's when we're going to pull up and set the hook. So as you can see, I have run the line through the eyelet on my jig head. What I'm going to do to tie that knot is run it through, hold the two ends of the line together. I'm going to spin my jig head maybe 4 or 5 times without getting the hook in my hand. Then I'm going to take the loose end, the tag end, and run it through the circle. Run it through the loop that's left. And then I'll pull that tight. I'll show you that one more time. So I've got this, I've spun it maybe 5 times. And I'm going to run the tag end through this hole right here. Once I do that, I'm going to tie it tight. Pull it real tight. And I always like to test it as if I were a fish, because sometimes these knots can come undone. There's nothing more frustrating than losing a fish because you didn't tie a knot right. So you can see here, if I pull it real tight, it's good. So what I'm going to do here is cut the rest of this line off. I'm ready to start drilling my holes.